Bom dia a todas as pessoas que estão aqui conosco. Eu queria, em nome da Faculdade de Direito, dar as boas-vindas a todas e todos. Faço em nome do professor Celso Campilongo, nosso diretor da faculdade, que pede desculpas por não estar aqui presente nesse evento, que para ele também é tão importante, mas porque teve que atender um chamado do reitor hoje na reitoria. E o que me deu uma oportunidade incrível de estar com vocês aqui e de prestigiar esse evento, e mais do que isso, de parabenizar vocês, né? Esse evento que já é um evento tão tradicional, né, na área do antitrust aqui no Brasil, e que é organizado por essa rede espetacular de mulheres atuantes, que são acadêmicas, advogadas, economistas, servidoras públicas, que tem promovido aí uma série de debates sobre a melhor compreensão e aplicação do direito concorrencial. Claro que quando a gente fala da WIA, dessa rede tão admirável, além da excelência dos debates, das reflexões, né, e dos contatos que promove, o que faz esse grupo merecer ainda mais o respeito e a admiração que merece é a questão do fortalecimento e do reconhecimento das mulheres no setor privado, no setor público e no setor acadêmico no que tange ao antitrust aqui no Brasil e no mundo, né? Porque a rede está cada vez mais internacional, pelo que eu soube. E quando eu falo desse especial destaque, o fortalecimento das mulheres, eu não quero dizer que nós mulheres precisemos de algum favor para ocupar os espaços, né? Não é isso que a gente quer dizer, mas porque a estrutura patriarcal e machista que nós temos na nossa sociedade acaba invisibilizando o mérito das mulheres, acaba produzindo desigualdades, muitas vezes no próprio campo simbólico, ou seja, aquilo que se pensa sobre o que os homens e mulheres são, fazem e podem fazer, tanto na vida profissional quanto na vida pessoal. E justamente essa cultura patriarcal e machista vai estabelecendo barreiras, ou tem estabelecido barreiras, não apenas para o ingresso e para a ascensão das mulheres em diversos setores, mas para o próprio pertencimento das pessoas nos espaços públicos, né? Essas inequidades de gênero são características da nossa sociedade, infelizmente, e ainda sujeitam a nós mulheres a todo tipo de violências latentes e manifestas, e a todo tipo de discriminação, né, submetendo as mulheres a vários estereótipos que ainda hoje nós encontramos. No universo do direito, embora a gente tenha, pegando para falar de números, se a gente olhar para a Ordem dos Advogados do Brasil, embora da 1.200.000 inscritos na ordem hoje metade seja mulher, né, isso não se reflete, essa equidade, né, ou essa paridade não se reflete nas carreiras, principalmente quando a gente fala da ascensão em cada carreira, né, seja na advocacia, seja nas atividades do setor público. Em qualquer carreira as mulheres vão desaparecendo com o tempo, né, vão sendo invisibilizadas, vão sendo postas para fora. E é preciso mudar nesse quadro. A WIA tem contribuído muito e de uma forma muito inspiradora para essa mudança. Essa mudança só pode se dar com educação de gênero e com representatividade, que é o que a gente tem aqui. Por isso eu fico muito, muito feliz e muito otimista, cada vez mais otimista, de ver, né, todas aqui. Quero aqui fazer uma saudação especial, um cumprimento especial à presidência da WIA, né, a doutora Priscila Brolio Gonçalves e a doutora Silvia Fagá, né, e nas pessoas delas eu cumprimento a todos e todas que estão aqui, principalmente a todas essas mulheres que trabalham com muito afinco, com muito esforço na WIA e têm fortalecido essa rede que, embora tão jovem, né, ela é de 2018, salvo engano, né, já quebrou uma série de barreiras e fez uma transformação naquilo que se pensa quando a gente fala da área de antitrust no nosso país. Isso tem fortalecido todas as mulheres, não só nessa área, mas em outras áreas também, e isso nos tem inspirado a todos, a todas, inclusive nessa faculdade de Direito. Então, eu quero dizer que é um orgulho enorme sediar esse evento. Sejam sempre, não só hoje, mas sempre muito bem-vindas. Parabéns pelo trabalho. E eu já estou curiosa para ouvir e participar dos painéis, dos 4 painéis que hoje nós teremos. Bem-vindas, bem-vindos e bom evento a todos.
Bom dia a todas e todos, é um prazer estar aqui. Queria agradecer à vice-diretora pela presença, pelas palavras também inspiradoras aqui. Também agradecer a minha companheira de mesa, a Silvia Fagar, que tem sido aqui lutadora, né, nessa nova fase da UIA. A gente, enfim, é um prazer estar aqui de volta no presencial depois de 3 anos, em que a gente a gente não realizou esse evento nos últimos 3 anos, a gente realizou uma série de eventos virtuais, desenvolveu atividades, né, o podcast, data da pandemia, eu estava aqui conversando com a professora Annelise. E, então, a gente tem uma série de iniciativas que são que projetam as mulheres, mas esse evento, para mim, é uma grande satisfação a gente poder voltar nesse formato presencial, embora a gente esteja aqui também, né, com o vídeo, que acho que chegou para ficar nas nossas vidas, né, as telas. Mas eu fico muito contente de ser aqui, justamente, que é a minha casa, onde eu fiz a minha graduação, meu mestrado, meu doutorado, e na área de antitruste, que é justamente a nossa área aqui de atuação da Women in Antitrust. Eu falo também em nome de todas as participantes da nossa rede, de todas as fundadoras que não puderam estar presentes hoje, em nome das diretoras, que temos aqui a Silvia, temos a Renata, em nome das gerentes, né, a Rafaela, que vai estar aqui no nosso primeiro painel. Então, eu queria agradecer a todos por essa oportunidade da gente estar aqui. E complementando também o que a nossa vice-diretora observou. Acho que a gente está com uma interferência de áudio aqui do Zoom. A gente tem uma identidade, eu vou falar muito rapidamente, porque eu não quero também delongar aqui antes da gente começar os nossos painéis, né? A gente está trazendo para vocês agora, para todas e todos que acompanham a UIA, a nossa nova identidade visual, que justamente busca acompanhar a evolução, né? A rede, que surgiu como um grupo de networking, buscando projetar, dar maior visibilidade às mulheres, gerar oportunidade de conversas, né, diálogos entre as mulheres e, de fato, dar uma ênfase ao trabalho, que a gente tem na área antitruste um percentual alto de mulheres advogadas, economistas, acadêmicas. É uma área onde tem um destaque muito grande com pessoas que estão em posições de sócios, de diretoria jurídica nas empresas, diretoras, como é o caso da Silvia na LCA. Então, a gente tem nessa área um grande número de mulheres, o que me fez questionar, quando eu comecei a participar, puxa, será que precisa, né, de um grupo como esse? E eu fico cada dia mais convencida de que sim, precisa de um grupo como esse, né? Que é justamente porque a gente está em tão grande número que a gente deveria estar também igualmente representada em outras áreas, né? E isso não necessariamente acontece. Então, acho que a gente tem que sim estar. A Leonor comentou comigo recentemente, a Leonor é uma das nossas fundadoras, que o primeiro evento da UIA presencial, que foi lá em Brasília, tinha uma plateia cheia de mulheres. Então, e todas as palestras foram realizadas, né, todas as mesas eram exclusivamente de mulheres. Isso gerou um impacto, uma estranheza naquele momento, né? E hoje eu penso, a gente vem reproduzindo esse modelo. Na verdade, nesse evento a gente tem participação masculina, que eu também agradeço pelos nossos palestrantes, né? O conselheiro Vitor, que está aqui entre nós, que também vai participar do primeiro painel. Mas esse impacto não deveria na verdade, não deveria causar surpresa às pessoas que a gente visse mesas compostas somente de mulheres, né? Porque a gente, pensando bem, todos os dias a gente vê mesas de homens, né? E a gente não estranha, a gente vê plenários, a gente vê situações em que somente homens estão representados e isso não gera estranheza. Então, eu acho que é justamente para poder gerar mais estranheza mesmo, porque que a gente não tem mesas ou mais representatividade feminina que a UIA está desenvolvendo nas suas atividades. E isso tem tudo a ver com a nossa nova marca, que ela busca, né, trazer impacto, trazer inclusão, diversidade. Então, a gente mudou, né, a gente está trazendo para vocês aqui em primeira mão, para quem está assistindo essa apresentação, a marca da UIA a partir de 2023. O nosso... Aqui a gente tem todas as nossas iniciativas, né? Ou as principais iniciativas. Então, a gente tem o Talks, que trata justamente de gênero, de inclusão, que tem sido aí conduzido pela Maíra e pela Renata, ambas estão aqui com a gente, já desde a origem. A gente tem o podcast da UIA, que tem a versão nacional e internacional. A gente tem os livros, né? A gente tem o IA Júniors, que a nossa diretora também, a Denise, que coordena, que busca desenvolver as mulheres, né, desde o início das suas carreiras, a mentoria. Aqui eu trouxe aqui as nossas fundadoras que infelizmente não puderam estar aqui nesse momento. A nossa diretoria hoje, então a gente está tentando trazer pessoas e hoje a gente está num processo, né? A Silvia sabe bem, está acompanhando muito isso. A gente está num processo de desenvolvimento de governança. A gente tem o nosso estatuto novo. Então a gente está tentando trazer mais pessoas e criar um grupo coeso, né, de pessoas aqui. Então, também queria apresentar para vocês esse grupo que está hoje à frente da UIA. E a Silvia está aqui do meu lado também. E, para fechar aqui a minha fala, falar um pouco justamente desse tema da participação, né? Eu queria trazer um dado que me chamou muita atenção. No ano passado, a gente fez uma pesquisa no IBRAC entre os associados e para entender quantas são as mulheres, né, da nossa área que participam, que atuam. E a gente descobriu que a gente tem 55% do público de antitrust, de eventos de antitrust mulheres, né? Essa pesquisa foi apresentada, inclusive, no evento internacional do IBRAC. E aí eu pedi, a Renata coordenou, me ajudou a coordenar essa pesquisa dentro da UIA. Quantas mulheres, né, qual que é o percentual de participação das mulheres como palestrante em eventos? E aí a gente percebe que tem uma quebra significativa, né? Mulheres que estão nas mesas, a gente tem apenas 41%. Então, a gente tem ali uma diferença de quase 15% nessas proporções, né? Então, por isso que eu acho que a gente tem que continuar fazendo esses eventos e chamando mulheres majoritariamente para integrar as mesas. Acho que esse é o papel, né, da Women in Antitrust. Eu queria finalizar aqui agradecendo a todos que estão aqui acompanhando, a todos que aceitaram participar desse evento e principalmente aos nossos patrocinadores também. A partir desse ano, a gente tem financiamento, então a gente tem nossas mantenedoras, a gente tem mulheres que custeiam as atividades, o dia a dia da UIA. E nós temos, nesse evento, nós inauguramos o patrocínio. Então, a gente tem a Ambev e o iFood, que são empresas que são patrocinadores ouro. Nós temos a LCA, o Secom e o BGA como patrocinadores prata. E nós temos o VCMA, o Tosini e o BMA, que são os nossos patrocinadores. Desculpa, gente, tô assim, depois da Covid, estou realmente com a cabeça ruim. E o BMA, que são nossos patrocinadores bronze. Então, eu queria agradecer aos nossos patrocinadores. A Silvia, se quiser falar algumas palavras também. E agradeço... o livro. Estão me lembrando do livro, gente. Sabia que eu ia esquecer. Queria também comentar com vocês, a gente está agora... Também temos um patrocínio para o nosso livro, Mulheres no Antitrust, que já tem 5 publicações, 5 edições em português. A gente está trabalhando na edição internacional desse livro. E a gente tem o edital do prêmio da Raizen, WIA Raizen. Também, pela primeira vez, a gente vai ter o prêmio patrocinado, né, por uma empresa. E a gente está há uma semana, há uma semana da entrega dos trabalhos. Então, quem quiser escrever, mandar artigos, a gente tem um processo super sério e rígido de blind review. De novo, a gente já tem 5 livros publicados, e então esses artigos vão ser artigos para o 6º livro. E, pela primeira vez, a gente tem um prêmio em dinheiro também para as autoras que forem nas 3 primeiras colocações do prêmio. Então, acho que eu não esqueci. Se eu esqueci de alguma coisa, alguém me avisa, por favor. E, senão, eu vou passar aqui para a Sílvia e dar lugar aqui ao nosso primeiro painel logo.
Bom dia a todos e a todas. Eu também só queria falar muito rapidamente, para não atrasar o primeiro painel, só agradecer novamente o empenho de todos que fizeram possível esse evento, agradecer também a vice-diretora, a Priscila, e registrar que, enquanto economista, também esse assunto é bastante sensível para mim, porque se no direito, pelo menos em termos de número de mulheres na faculdade ou registradas na OAB, já chega no meio a meio, na economia isso está muito longe de acontecer, historicamente acho que não chegou nem perto disso. No antitrust, os economistas costumam compor uma comunidade mais restrita, bem menor do que a da dos advogados, mas mesmo assim é um tema sensível, e a gente acha bem importante que tenha oportunidade de ter mais representatividade e inclusão. E aí, só reforçando o ponto da Priscila, sobre os números, né, a gente também verifica ali que os números por si só não indicam a realidade do que é ser mulher e várias outras questões que envolvem diversidade e inclusão. Então, a gente não pode só se apoiar nos números para entender que os problemas estão resolvidos, porque mesmo que a gente tenha até representatividade em liderança e nos eventos, por trás ainda acontecem muitos problemas para que as mulheres consigam chegar lá. Então, esse é o ponto, é a sutileza que pode parecer sutileza ou um problema de segunda ordem, mas não é. Tá? Então, eu queria registrar esses pontos e já agradecer novamente e passar, talvez, para o primeiro painel já.
Obrigada. Não sei se a professora quer comentar mais alguma coisa. Então, eu vou chamar, desde logo, a nossa moderadora do primeiro painel, a doutora Rafaela, que também é gerente da nossa rede, e agradeço a todos pela presença.
Hi, morning, everyone. This panel will be in English so that Professor Amelia Fletcher can understand us. So I'd like to ask to join me Victor, Commissioner from Cade, Anahi Llop, representing Câmara E-Net. And we have also Samara Castro, which I believe is in the airport, but she's coming in a few minutes. So to start, I wanted, on behalf of WIA, to thank you all for joining us today. This is a very special event for us, the first face-to-face event after the pandemic. It is great to see a lot of friendly faces today. And special thanks to the panelists for making room in their very busy agendas to participate in our panel. I also wanted to thank WIA and the sponsors for making room for the young generation of women and antitrust like me to have a voice and to feel represented in such an important event. We feel very supported by you, and we hope that we can continue to support each other and also the next generations to come. So our panel will mainly discuss today the regulatory initiatives in digital markets and the role of competition defense in the architecture of choice. So we have gathered here today a diverse group of experts to discuss not only the interface between competition and ex-ante regulation and also economics inside, but other relevant regulatory initiatives tackling broader goals, such as the protection of fundamental rights and the debate surrounding freedom of expression and fake news. So just to have a full presentation and description of the panelists, I wanted to say that we have here with us today Professor Amelia Fletcher from the University of East Anglia, Victor Fernandes, which is here with us, Commissioner from Cade, Samara Castro, which is the current Director of the Department for the Promotion of Freedom of Expression from Secom, which is Social Communication Secretariat belonging from the federal government. And we have also Anahi Llop, representing Câmara E-Net, which is a multi-sectoral entity that gathers lots of relevant players in the digital field and that contributes to the design and also to achieving more effective regulatory milestones. So, as you all know, regulation in digital markets is an ever-evolving topic. It is at the top of the agenda of many relevant jurisdictions and authorities all over the world. And it seems like in the beginning of the debate, the discussion was more focused on the actual need of having specific regulation for digital platforms. And now, more recently, it seems that the debate is shifting and the discussions are more focused on the design of suitable and more efficient ex-ante regulatory approaches for the digital field in order to supplement a traditional ex-post intervention from antitrust authorities. So, currently, we have a number of proposals on the table, some of them actually being implemented, such as the Digital Markets Act in the European Union, one of the leading ex-ante regulations that addresses concerns of contestability and fairness in the digital scenario. And in Brazil, we have ongoing bills tackling different regulatory goals. For instance, we have Bill 2768 from 2022, clearly inspired in the DMA, which intends to regulate digital platforms holding essential control, essential access control. And we have also Bill 2630 from 2020, which tackles fake news and misinformation concerns. So we hope that this panel could shed some light on current discussions on the best regulatory strategies for the digital scenario. So following the dynamic nature of the debate, we intend to do a dynamic panel as well. We are going to do here a Q&A format. So I just wanted to move forward to our first panelist, Professor Amelia Fletcher. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us today. We are very, very honored with your presence, and we hope that we could meet in person in the next opportunity. Well, as I mentioned, the DMA is one of the leading ex-ante regulations tackling competition concerns within the digital scenario. So, Professor Amelia, could you share your thoughts on key regulatory obligations set forth in a DMA, its current status, or any other relevant aspects that you deem essential for the debate surrounding regulatory alternatives for digital platforms? Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for inviting me to be to speak at this important debate. I'm very, very supportive of all efforts to get better female representation within antitrust, and it was lovely to hear your words about the support that WIA gives younger antitrust professionals in Brazil. I'm also very sorry I can't be there, and also very sorry that I'm having to speak in English because my Portuguese is terrible, but thank you for indulging both. So I think, I hope that I won't have set this kind of at too high a level, but hopefully those that are already very au fait with regulation will find something of interest in what I was going to say. But I thought it was useful to just do some introductory words, really. So I think, first of all, I'm going to be talking about the EU, the European Digital Markets Act, and I think it's useful to see that in the context of a variety of other European initiatives in the digital space, and it sounds like Brazil is in a similar place there. So in particular in the EU, we also have the Digital Services Act, which is all about addressing online harms, and it's useful to see the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act as working kind of in tandem. Of course, the Digital Markets Act is focused, as we've just heard, on competition, and it has been designed to address the entrenched market positions held in a number of critical online markets by a small number of key players, and it terms those players gatekeepers. And it seeks to do that by first designating those players who will be in scope based primarily on a set of quantitative thresholds, and one of the big design questions is indeed how you set who is in scope, and whether you should just do it on quantitative thresholds or whether it should be more qualitative. The EU has gone broadly for quantitative. The law has actually applied since May this year, and so the designation process is currently ongoing. And so far, it looks like it's going to be the big five that we all expected. So Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Meta, Microsoft, plus two slightly less expected firms, but they make sense. So one is Samsung, who make the vast majority of Android phones in the EU, and the other is ByteDance, who own TikTok. So in practice, in the regulation, it's not just the firms that are designated, but also their specific platform services. And there are only a specific set of core platform services that can be designated. So the scope is restricted in the law in that way. And those include a number of things such as operating systems, search engines, web browsers, social networks, and intermediation services, which includes app stores and marketplaces. And then what the regulation does, and I think what all of these forms of ex-ante regulation are trying to do, is it sets a series of ex-ante rules on those firms for their conduct. And those rules are basically designed to do two main things. The first is to try and open up these markets to competition. They've become very entrenched. The market, they've got huge barriers to entry and expansion within them. So the rules are trying to open up them to more competition. And rules relating to things like data access, easier switching, data portability, interoperability, and the requirement to allow alternative app stores on a device. All of those are relevant to really trying to open up these very monopolized markets. But second, and importantly, and I think any form of regulation has to do these two things in tandem, it also recognizes that opening up these markets is likely to be hard and to take time. And so it also seeks to ensure that firms are not unduly able to exploit that market position or unfairly leverage it into new areas. And so that leads to rules such as no self-preferencing in ranking, FRAND access to app stores, restrictions on tying, things like that. So as was mentioned, the formal objectives of the Digital Markets Act are contestability and fairness. Other regulations may have different objectives. I think what's worth really highlighting is that is an implicit objective of, I think, all of the attempts to regulate in this space, which isn't stated, but it's innovation. And I think there's a really strong focus in the design of these regulations on really enabling business users and potential rivals of these platforms to innovate. So, for example, that can be done by giving them fairer access to end users, access to relevant data, access to key technology to work alongside their innovations through interoperability, and actually access to the economic fruits of their innovation. So actually getting some rents. So just to compare a little bit with competition law, which obviously works in a similar area, I see there as being three key differences. I think the first is that this sort of economic regulation provides a detailed set of guardrails for acceptable conduct that both the gatekeepers understand, and it actually should be good for the gatekeepers in that context, but importantly also their rivals understand, so they know what playing field they are basically trying to play on. And that should be much clearer, I think, than at least the antitrust we've had historically, and therefore better for proactively promoting a competitive and innovative environment. The second is, and I think this is a really interesting part of the design of the Digital Markets Act, is it places the burden of demonstrating compliance on the firms themselves. They need to provide an annual compliance report. And clearly that's really different to antitrust, where it's up to the authority to monitor and spot non-compliance. And the third point is that enforcement, if needed, and ideally you don't ever have enforcement in regulation, it just works. But if you need enforcement, I think it should be easier. So the European Commission will still need to prove that there's been breach of one of its rules, but it won't need to show that that breach causes harm. That can just be assumed, and that should make enforcement much easier. It should also require much less use of economics, or at least a rather different use of economics. And I've recently co-authored a paper actually on the use of economics, the expected use of economics in the Digital Markets Act. So I should just note, I mean, obviously Brazil's got its own legislation. The UK has legislation also going through to introduce regulation, which will be broadly similar. But there are many, many design choices here. And actually in the UK, the rule setting is going to be left up to the regulator rather than put in the legislation. The idea there is it can be somewhat more evidence-based and bespoke to each platform. The minus is it maybe doesn't provide quite the level of upfront clarity that the EU is providing. In practice, though, I personally expect that in the end, the two regimes will be pretty well aligned, because that's going to be the best thing. And I think that raises a final issue I just wanted to highlight, particularly in the context of this conference, which is, of course, that these gatekeeper platforms are more or less global. And that means that they are going to be needing to think about their compliance on a global basis, even though the Digital Markets Act is only applicable in the EU. It also means that from the point of view of their competitors, actually a common set of guardrails globally, a common framework for competition, is actually going to provide the best environment for new entry and innovation. So that raises a number of points. First, I think it means that it's likely that some, if not, albeit probably not all, of the EU rules will actually have extraterritorial effects, potentially even in Brazil. And I think obviously this will be for the gatekeepers to decide, but I think for at least some requirements, they may well conclude that changing their practices globally is likely to be cheaper and perhaps also reduce regulatory and reputational risk. Secondly, I think even if the firms don't want to do this naturally, I think the fact that they've changed their conduct in the EU may have implications for antitrust cases taken in other jurisdictions, even where there isn't local regulation. So, for example, in relation to remedies, the costs and benefits of particular options may well be altered by what that gatekeeper is doing in the EU. It's going to be a lot cheaper to introduce interoperability if you're already doing that somewhere else in the world. And I think what that means is that even if we don't see regulation occurring in other jurisdictions, which of course remains possible too, and where we do, it will be really good to have as much alignment as possible. But we may, even in other jurisdictions, expect to see competition authorities increasingly seeking similar changes to the conduct of these firms, but through antitrust. So I'll leave it there. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you very much for these valuable contributions, Professor Amelia. I just wanted to, within this debate of regulatory obligations, particularly in the DMA context, I have read a very enlightening paper that you written with Professor Zira Vazas on the role of behavioral insights in the DMA implementation. So could you try to explain to us what are such behavioral insights, and what do you think they are relevant for designing regulations for the digital markets?
Okay, so I think, thank you. There has been increasing recognition that behavioral factors, behavioral insights, have in the past been exploited cleverly by the major gatekeepers and other firms to protect and extend their market positions. So behavioral factors are essentially the things about us as people that are not completely and utterly rational, like a computer would be rational. So they are things like we tend to take the easy way out because thinking takes energy and resource. We can do it, but it's hard. So we take the easy way out. We'll use rules of thumb. We'll stick with defaults. We'll stick with the status quo. We'll choose the highest ranked of a set of options that are ranked. So those are well understood behavioral insights. They relate to all of us, not just vulnerable people. We all exhibit these sorts of behavioral insights. And what's actually interesting is that two of the major EU antitrust cases against Google, so Google Shopping and Google Android, both were really dependent on these sorts of behavioral insights. So in the case of Google Shopping, the concerns related to Google leveraging from its position in general search into shopping comparison by giving prominence to its own proprietary shopping box and down-ranking rival comparison sites. Now, why was that even an issue? It was an issue because consumers' choices tend to exhibit both saliency effects, so the prominence actually matters, and also ranking effects, so that the rankings actually matter for consumer choices. In the case of Google Android, the concerns related to Google requiring Android phone manufacturers, such as Samsung, to install Google Search as the default search service. Again, why does that matter? People can always change to another search service, and it's free to do so. The reason it matters is that consumers tend to accept defaults and then they tend to stick with the status quo. And so if Google Search is the default search service, then that naturally confers on it a high and long-term share of that market. So those were the big cases that I think really raised awareness of the importance of behavioral insights for market power and leveraging of market power. And I think given that understanding of their competitive importance, it's perhaps not surprising that the Digital Markets Act itself includes quite a few elements that reflect these insights. So the most obvious area relates to defaults. Now, defaults are not necessarily bad because they can make things easier for consumers. So if we get a new phone, we don't want to have to make an active choice about absolutely every element of how that phone works. We'd never get the phone going. But as we can see, defaults can also be anti-competitive. So there's this balance to be struck. And so what the DMA is, it does that in three key ways in relation to defaults. First of all, it requires that any defaults within an operating system, browser, or virtual assistant should be possible to switch and also should be easy to switch. The second is that for three key areas where there have been particular competition concerns, so browsers, search engines, and virtual assistants, the DMA actually requires gatekeepers to give consumers an active choice of default the first time they use those services. And third, there's a requirement that if you've downloaded an app from a third party, that downloaded app should be able to prompt users to make that third-party service their default. So those are ways to try and make changing of defaults easier. The thing about the issue of ranking effects is also reflected in the prohibition on self-preferencing in rankings. And more generally, there's just a number of DMA rules which make it clear that end users should not only be able to do certain things, such as switching or terminating a service, but to do so easily. And that easily, I think, really reflects the behavioral insights that we have. I think there's also one section of the Digital Markets Act which is about circumvention. It's about trying to prevent gatekeepers from circumventing the kind of principle of the rules by kind of undermining them. And one way in which they could do so is by carefully designing their user interfaces to steer users in particular ways, even though they don't have to go in those ways. And that section specifically prohibits gatekeepers from misleading users through their interfaces in this way. So I think these various initiatives they're really important. They do raise really difficult issues of implementation. So, for example, if end users are to be given an active choice of search services, how should that choice architecture around how the options are offered to people be designed? How many choices should there be? How should they be ranked? How should they be presented? What colors are used? What additional information should be provided? So again, behavioral insights are likely to be critical here. So we know, for example, that too many choices or too much information can actually make consumers make worse decisions rather than better. But equally, some choice and information is very useful. So trying to get this right is far from straightforward. There's likely to be some really key design principles that will help in thinking through the design of this choice architecture. And a lot of people are currently thinking about what these principles might look like. But I think overall, actually, it's going to be really hard to do any of this from first principles. It's really going to require empirical testing. And I think, therefore, we should expect to see gatekeepers and perhaps also their rivals really testing out the different choice architecture options, either in experimental settings or in the field, to see which ones really work. But I think this is going to be quite a very interesting area, potentially quite a contentious area, potentially an area where economics comes back in. Yes, I would. I think it's very, very interesting and pretty novel. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much, Professor Amelia. The DMA is clearly very inspiring, and it's already inspiring other regulatory approaches in other jurisdictions. In Brazil, we are currently discussing Bill 2768 from 2022, which means to supplement traditional ex-post intervention. So in this context, I would like to ask Commissioner Victor Fernandes to share his thoughts on the current bill. If you could talk a little bit about what are the key foundation of such ex-ante regulatory proposal, particularly the intended regulatory goals, the main obligations, the regulatory targets involved, and also the proposed regulator. So, Commissioner Victor, the floor is yours.
So, good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this event for the opportunity of being here. And on behalf of Cade, I must say that the Women in Antitrust Network is a very vibrant community in Brazil supporting gender equality. So it's a huge honor for me to be here today and to be part of this annual conference and with such renowned scholars, academics, and professors, and economics and lawyers in Brazil. So thank you very much for this opportunity indeed. And second, I must make a disclaimer that everything that I'm going to say is on my personal opinions. So, of course, my opinions are not binding on Cade. Cade is a very plural institution, so all of this, its officials are free to express their own ideas. And I would like to give you some very broader review about the Brazilian draft, the Brazilian proposal, and I promise that I will keep it very brief, but I have some slides here, and I want to say that this proposal, that is the first proposal to regulate competition among digital platforms in Brazil, it was proposed to the National Congress on November 10th of last year. And it's important to say, first of all, that unlikely what have happened in other jurisdictions, the Brazilian proposal was not preceded by any kind of public consultation or assessment of regulatory impact or some government-led evaluation of the competition law toolkit that we have right now. And I think that's a very important point to emphasize here, because in the EU, in the European Union, and in the US, of course, we have had these very insightful reports, the specialist reports, the Siegel reports. In the UK, we have had the Furman report as well, that set the stage about the competition law enforcement against digital platforms. And I think that we should have this in Brazil as well, because we must know exactly what are the main shortcomings involved in our Brazilian Competition Law Act. So in order, to put this in perspective, to complement this with some new ex-ante regulations. And our proposal also draws inspiration from the DMA. So the DMA here is actually a very inevitable reference point for that debate. But at the same time, the Brazilian legislators would like to provide a unique Brazilian approach to that. So when we see, for example, the explanatory memorandum, which was penned by Congressman John Maia, he clearly states that we believe it's appropriate to implement a regulation similar to that of the European Commission, so the DMA, but in a much less detailed form. So, and also the memorandum states that it's not appropriate to bind economic agents ex ante with a list of absolute prohibitions. And on top of that, another huge difference when we compare to the DMA is that the Brazilian proposal elects the telecommunication regulator, Anatel, as the digital regulator for implementing this new legislation. And also in the explanatory memorandum, we can see that the reason behind that is that, in the view of the lawmaker, Anatel possesses a regulatory expertise that closely mirrors the requirements for the whole of digital platforms regulator, which I think that might be some subject to some debate on that. I am not sure if that's completely true. And just to give you some very broader review about the draft, I would like to mention 3 points. So first, what are the regulatory goals behind that proposal? And the regulatory goals are very, very deeply multiple and diverse in that regard. So Articles 5 and 4 of the proposal states as goals of the new regulation things like fair competition, consumer protection, reduction of regional and social inequalities, access to information, knowledge, and culture. So we can see here that we have some non-economic values that are involved, but our proposal does not provide clearly what is the substantive standard of competition that we seek to build up. So we do not have any explanation and meaning about what is fair competition. So we do not have a clause which is similar to the definitions of contestability and fairness in the DMA and things like that. The second point I think is worth mentioning is the designation of platforms holding essential access control power. And here we also do not have any definition of what it means to have essential access control power. But the designation process is only based on quantitative criteria, which is a criteria based on turnover of the firms. So if the firms check this turnover, they will be designated as platforms holding essential access control power. And the third point that I think that we should be very aware are the lists of regulatory obligations. And here we see a very different approach from what occurs in the DMA. When we see the obligations, we can see that there are just 4 very broadly defined regulatory obligations that are being subjected to further specification by Anatel. So, and in the DMA, we have 2 lists of regulatory obligations. In Article 5, we have this self-execution regulatory obligations. So there are obligations that must be complied immediately by digital platforms. And then we have the Article 6, which are the obligations that are being subject to further specifications. And in contracts, in the Brazilian proposal, we just have the Article 6 in that sense to make some comparison with the DMA. So the 4 obligations are very much close to the ones that are designed into the DMA, but some of them are very confusing in the wording. For instance, when we see Article 10.2, the obligation to set isonomic and non-discriminatory treatment in the provision of service to professional users and ends. It seems like some ban on self-preferencing, but it's not very clear what is the scope of this obligation. We have a very broad and very undefined obligation to proper use of data collected during its activities. It seems that the intention behind that might be related to prohibition of cross-use of data without users' consent, just like we see in Article 5.2 of the DMA, and which is much discussed in the German Facebook case. But again, the wording of the proposal is very unclear. And finally, we have some interoperability and data portability remedies that should be adopted by Anatel. And to finish, and I'm sorry for running out of time, but I think that there is a great lack of clarity on the regulatory goals of this proposal, and I think that we should be very aware that the DMA is very, very detailed, especially when we read the recitals of the DMA to what is the meaning of contestability and fairness that the DMA seeks to build. So recitals 32 and 33 are indeed very important to understand the DMA, to understand what is the unique nature of ex-ante initiative that we are talking about here. The second point is that I think that the Brazilian proposal misses the point of what is the goal, what is the economics and the aims behind these new ex-ante initiatives. Because those new ex-ante initiatives are mainly about digital ecosystems regulation. So we see where is the gatekeeper, and we try to solve a problem, a huge problem of imbalance between rights and obligations between the core platform and the complementors that are in adjacent markets. So that is the whole idea. I'm sorry. That's the whole idea of the DMA. So we have to understand digital ecosystem economics. Professor Amelia Fletcher also has a very interesting contribution to OECD on that topic that I recommend you to read. But I think that the Brazilian proposal gets the point wrong, because it adopts some kind of public utility approach. And maybe that is the reason for the legislator to design the implementation of these obligations like that, and maybe that's the reason that the Brazilian proposal is going to be embraced by Anatel, the telecommunications regulator. Third point, I think that there are some very profound trade-offs involved in setting ex-ante initiatives and ex-ante obligations. And I think that the DMA makes a very smart decision in designing Article 5 and Article 6 in that regard, so we can have some flexibility in Article 6 obligations, but Article 5 we're gonna be more clear-cut obligations. And the Brazilian proposal does not make that, and that might be a problem, because the 4 obligations are very broadly defined, and then Anatel will have a huge administrative discretion in designing and shaping these obligations. And last, I think that the DMA have plenty of implementation procedures, regulations. So the idea behind the designation of gatekeeper, which is a proper procedural phase of the implementation of this law. The idea of markets investigation, which is very important to shape the Article 6 obligations. And the whole idea of Article 5 and Article 6 provides a much more nuanced approach and a much more smart approach to shaping these obligations. So those are the points that I think that are worth mentioning about the Brazilian draft. Thank you, Rafaela.
Thank you very much. I think it's not working. Yes, it is working now. As I mentioned at the beginning of the panel, it is also important to discuss other types of regulatory approaches with broader regulatory goals that goes beyond the protection of competition, such as regulation tackling fundamental rights, the protection of freedom of expression, and regulatory approaches surrounding concerns of misinformation and fundamental rights. So in this context, I would like to ask Samara Castro if she can comment on the current regulatory initiatives tackling misinformation and fake news in Brazil. Thank you, Samara, for joining us.
Bom dia a todas e a todos. Gostaria primeiro de agradecer pelo convite. Esse é um evento muito importante e fico muito feliz em poder contribuir aqui em nome da Secretaria de Políticas Digitais, da Secretaria de Comunicação Social da Presidência da República. Nós, inclusive, a minha diretoria, que é a diretoria de promoção à liberdade de expressão, ela é composta integralmente de mulheres. Então, é muito bom ver essa plateia também tão repleta de mulheres para que a gente possa debater temas tão importantes. Eu gostaria de começar dizendo que, pelo governo, nós temos algumas ações de enfrentamento à desinformação e de enfrentamento às questões regulatórias que vão para além de só os projetos que hoje estão em tramitação no Legislativo. E essa concepção de olhar para o que o Poder Executivo pode fazer nesse enfrentamento, nessa batalha, que é realmente conseguir integrar e garantir uma integridade informacional mais aprofundada, nós temos algumas ações em andamento. Eu acho que não é segredo para ninguém o projeto de lei que está em tramitação há alguns anos, que é o projeto de lei 2630, ele hoje centraliza uma parte importante e grande da regulação do ponto de vista dos serviços digitais. Eu acho que Vitor já detalhou bastante aqui o que a gente tem do ponto de vista regulatório para mercados. Mas do ponto de vista de serviços e do ponto de vista, inclusive, de proteção de direitos humanos e de liberdade de expressão, hoje o projeto de lei 2630 é o que a gente tem de mais avançado na tramitação legislativa. Ele, inclusive, foi dividido e uma parte da discussão que estava no projeto 2630, ela foi repassada para o projeto 2370, que estava em pauta no dia de ontem, que provavelmente será votado na semana que vem. Esse projeto ficou com 3 temas centrais. O tema do jornalismo, da sustentabilidade do jornalismo, o tema dos direitos autorais e o tema da publicidade. Por que eu digo isso? Porque uma parte importante do que a gente tem do ponto de vista regulatório e que se encaixa ali com as questões de anticompetitivas e de problemas de relação de mercado está justamente na discussão de publicidade, que é onde a gente tem hoje talvez a maior falta de transparência e a menor capacidade de ter informações sobre como essas práticas estão acontecendo entre os anunciantes, os intermediários e aquilo que chega aos próprios usuários. Mas deixando esse parêntese aqui de lado, eu queria tratar um pouco sobre quais são as iniciativas que são possíveis de serem feitas quando a gente ainda não tem uma regulação completamente acabada. E esse debate ele tem acontecido muito a nível global. Nós, inclusive, estivemos na última reunião da OCDE, que tratava exclusivamente de como os governos, como os poderes executivos dos países poderiam organizar frentes de enfrentamento à desinformação e de preservação da integridade informacional. E aqui pelo Brasil, nós estamos construindo e colocando de pé um plano que tem as seguintes áreas de atuação. Primeiro, a necessidade de uma articulação institucional profunda, entendendo que uma parte grande da desinformação e das consequências dela, porque o que a gente precisa discutir é efetivamente os impactos dessa desinformação nas políticas públicas, uma parte grande disso se impacta pela falta de confiança que as instituições hoje são submetidas. Isso foi muito nítido no processo eleitoral, onde a gente saía de uma justiça eleitoral com uma das instituições, como uma das instituições mais confiáveis do país, para uma instituição permanentemente questionada. E não é diferente com várias outras instituições e políticas públicas. Um exemplo muito nítido é o da própria vacinação, e é o que a gente hoje está olhando com mais cuidado, uma vez que é um balão de ensaio mais fácil de metrificar. Além dessa articulação institucional, que envolve não só os poderes, mas também a sociedade civil, também a academia, também todos os porta-vozes dessas questões, um aspecto muito fundamental é a necessidade de criação de comunicação estratégica, entendendo hoje que os fenômenos de desinformação, eles se comunicam, eles se difundem por uma estrutura muito consolidada de entrega de mensagens e uma estrutura também bastante consolidada de direcionamento das mensagens para aquelas pessoas que estão mais suscetíveis a mensagens de determinados tipos. Então, a necessidade de criação de uma estrutura de comunicação estratégica que veja realmente, da mesma maneira, quais são as melhores mensagens para os perfis específicos que precisam ser tocados, também é muito importante. Além disso, a capacidade de mobilização e capacitação não só dos agentes públicos, mas de quem está na ponta lidando com aquelas pessoas que estão mais suscetíveis à desinformação que afete políticas públicas. Além disso, a necessidade de criação, isso também é um desafio a nível global, de estruturas de inteligência e de escuta social, para que a gente possa entender, antecipar e conseguir ter medidas efetivas sobre assuntos que eventualmente possam ser objeto de desinformação, de fraude, de golpe. E aqui, acho que um exemplo também muito recente é o que aconteceu com o próprio projeto Desenrola, que foi objeto de muitas fraudes, que foi objeto, inclusive, de muitos conteúdos, que foram conteúdos impulsionados, que viraram publicidade, justamente para tentar fazer com que aquela política pública fosse capturada para ser objeto de ação ilegal, de fraude, de conseguir com que as pessoas deixassem de fazer o pagamento das suas dívidas da maneira correta para pagarem, muitas vezes, boletos que estavam indo para criminosos. Então, esse é o tipo de impacto que a desinformação pode ter nas nossas vidas. E é o tipo de coisa que a gente busca cercar quando a gente constrói um plano estruturado dentro do executivo. Além disso, uma previsão de investigação, de responsabilização dentro daquilo que é colocado como os órgãos capazes de fazer nas polícias, a própria controladoria, em caso de servidores públicos, e distribuída entre o Estado. E, por último, acho que, não menos importante, mas muito fundamental, a colaboração com as próprias plataformas e a perspectiva de que elas sejam parceiras naqueles recursos que já estão disponibilizados de enfrentamento à desinformação. Hoje, essa estrutura tem sido colocada em prática, está em fase de teste, para que a gente justamente consiga ter essa experiência de enfrentamento à desinformação por parte do Executivo. Isso, por si só, não é suficiente, mas contempla e acopla aos processos regulatórios que estão acontecendo no Brasil e que nós temos uma perspectiva, uma expectativa de que se encerrem, pelo menos nessa primeira etapa do projeto 2630, do projeto 2370, no próximo semestre, né, ao decurso desse próximo semestre.
Thank you very much, Samara. Thinking about in ways that we could benefit from this interdisciplinary debate, do you think there are relevant regulatory commands or behavioral insights mentioned in the regulatory initiatives tackling fake news or misinformation that could be helpful for regulating competition concerns within the digital field?
Sem dúvida. Principalmente quando a gente pensa num debate que, por vezes, está fora de moda, mas ele sempre volta de alguma maneira. Eu estou vendo aqui a Camila que faz ele bastante. Mas acho que um debate muito interessante que a gente precisa olhar no enfrentamento à desinformação, que muitas vezes não está colocado num primeiro momento, é a maneira pela qual nós acessamos a informação hoje. A maneira pela qual essas plataformas estão disponíveis para as pessoas e como as pessoas se informam. E aí vem a discussão eterna do zero rating e a maneira pela qual nós lidamos com isso hoje. Eu tive a oportunidade de, no último mês, passar uma semana em São Francisco com o pessoal do ITF, discutindo justamente as questões de PV6 e de zero rating. E era muito impressionante a troca com os outros países na compreensão da maneira pela qual a gente identifica a nossa internet e o acesso à nossa internet. E a concepção de internet como uma rede, né, conectada, a rede das redes, que conecta outras redes e que possibilita que as pessoas tenham acesso às informações, ela não se reflete no acesso que hoje a nossa população tem às informações via seus celulares. Na prática, nós não estamos com uma população conectada à internet. Nós estamos com a população conectada a plataformas específicas. E isso é muito danoso e é um dos elementos mais centrais para a nossa incapacidade de lidar da maneira como deveríamos, com o tamanho que tem o problema da desinformação. Então, é urgente que a gente faça essa discussão a respeito do zero rating e da maneira pela qual esses contratos, essas colaborações não têm transparência, não são públicas e nós não sabemos como elas acontecem. Por vezes, inclusive, e é uma possibilidade que isso esteja sendo encarecido, supervalorizado e, com certeza, retirando do mercado outras plataformas que possivelmente poderiam ser objeto de informação das pessoas. Então, eu acho que essa é uma prática extremamente nociva, a forma como ela se dá hoje no Brasil. Nós precisamos enfrentá-la. Não estou dizendo aqui que a solução é ter ou não ter o zero rating para coisas específicas, mas, sem dúvida nenhuma, a solução é, pelo menos, entender como isso se dá no Brasil hoje. Porque acho que só a partir dessa compreensão nós vamos saber lidar com a maneira vamos ter a oportunidade de lidar da maneira correta com a discussão. Seja tendo para todo mundo, seja tendo para ninguém, mas, de alguma maneira, saber qual é essa ferramenta. E acho que um segundo ponto, e esse do zero rating, ele me toca profundamente, porque ele pode, muitas vezes, ser uma solução para a gente, e ele tem sido um problema profundo, porque ele desconecta e separa as pessoas ao a gente não ter essa transparência de como isso é colocado. E um outro aspecto aqui para finalizar e que eu acho que, aprovado o PL 2630, a gente teria condições de olhar para isso com mais cuidado, seja o Cade, sejam outras organizações que têm essa competência, é a capacidade da gente ter transparência sobre os anúncios, que a gente saiba efetivamente como o mercado publicitário atua no ambiente digital, porque nós não sabemos como esses anunciantes estão fazendo, nós não sabemos se existem essas práticas anticompetitivas, porque a gente não tem essas informações. E, muitas vezes, os poucos estudos que são disponibilizados são descredenciados, são descredibilizados, ao a gente dizer que a gente não está tratando do universo total. Então, eu acho que, quando a gente tiver esse acesso mais sofisticado a essas informações, isso vai ser muito importante. E finalizo informando que, pelo governo federal, nós temos feito um trabalho de discussão específico sobre a forma que a publicidade institucional acontece e como ela é distribuída. E acho que nos próximos meses isso também vai ficar público para consulta, para discussão com a academia e com a sociedade civil.
Thank you very much, Samara. This was very, very helpful. So we have discussed today some key ex-ante regulatory proposals for digital markets, their main regulatory goals, some relevant regulatory commands as well, and also the relevance of behavioral insights. So another important topic that is drawing the attention of experts and regulators around the world is the role of the regulatory targets in this context. So, Anahi, as the representative of the regulatory targets in this panel, what do you think could be the role of digital platforms in the design and in the implementation of regulation? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here on behalf of Câmara E-Net. Câmara E-Net is an entity founded in 2001 to promote Brazilian digital environment. It was recognized by OECD as the most representative association in the sector. And to answer your question, I think we should, first of all, recognize that Brazil is a different environment. Brazil is a continental country with particularities in the market. So we should see with many attention any regulatory initiative, because some regulatory initiatives from abroad, it's not only copy and paste here for our environment. Also, we have to have caution when we talk about digital platforms, because we are talking about much more about technology in all the sectors, the use of technology in all the sectors, like retail, health, entertainment, audiovisual industry. So any regulatory initiative has to look that all the economic, all the digital economic will be affected by these such initiatives. Like, for example, artificial intelligence. We have many manufacturings and many different sectors of the economy applying intelligence, artificial intelligence. So a new regulatory initiative about that will impact not only the big tech companies, that is the first kind of company that comes to our mind, but all the economy. Regarding the tasks of the association and of the companies that works in this environment, these private ends are the most qualified allies to feed civil society, the government, with high level and realistic information and inputs about the regulation and the design of this regulation. So we are enabled to guarantee, to give inputs that should guarantee competitive environment and innovation. It's very important that for any regulation that ensures a competitive environment and an innovation environment. Brazil has a lot of startups. Brazil has a lot of unicorns between the companies that are settled here. So it's very important to keep this kind of environment. It's also important the discussion with all the society, the civil society, the academic, the private agents. This conversation and these discussions is very important in designing of a new regulation. So I think these are the main topics that the private agents and the techs could help.
Thank you very much. Thinking about some examples, some practical examples of such initiatives, maybe Anahi, you could explain to the audience and show some practical example of such initiatives taken by Câmara E-Net to help in the implementation or on the design of regulation in the Brazilian scenario.
For sure. I think it's important to reinforce the plurality of members of Câmara E-Net. We have members from all sectors, like travel, hospitality, food, mobility, even pet service providers. This plurality of members is very important when Câmara E-Net comes with some statement regarding new regulation, because it reflects all the analysis of these private agents that are member of the entity. The association helps speaking and having a close relationship, not only with National Congress, with the executive, but also with the academic, with agents and entities like Anvisa, Anatel, Ancine, ANS, all kinds of agents, attending to hearings and public discussions, and also public consultation. I think one of the most beautiful works that not Câmara E-Net worked, but all the society was really engaged was the internet framework, the Marco Civil da Internet. It was really an example of law. It's an example for many countries abroad. And it was a work that Câmara E-Net participates a lot with the public debates. this law was sanctioned in 2014, if I'm not wrong, but the discussions they began in 2011 or even before that. So what I'm saying, we have this amazing law, but we have a huge time to debate with all the segments and all the sectors the impact of this law. Because of that, I think we have so great result. But it's not the only example that we have. We also have the LGPD, that the Brazilian General Data Protection Law, that Câmara E-Net helped a lot with many statements and many public discussion. And also we are now speaking and studying a lot the artificial intelligence. So I think these are kind of examples that we can help the environment in general.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you, Anahi. Thank you, Professor Amelia, Victor, and Samara, for your valuable contributions today. I'm very honored to be moderating this panel. I believe we have a few minutes left for additional Q&As from the audience. Does anyone have a question for our panelists? Anyone wants to begin? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Priscilla, representing the Women in Antitrust. It was a very nice panel. Thank you for all the speakers. I would like to understand better, because the subject about zero rating that was mentioned by Samara, I understand that some years ago, all the authorities at the time were investigating or active in analyzing the impacts of zero rating policies. So I would like to know if is there any initiative to reopen this discussion from the federal government, and also if the other participants of the panel would like to comment, maybe Amelia from the perspective of the zero rating in the US, or so thank you.
Como eu disse, esse é um debate que está aberto no mundo. Ele retorna com força quando a gente começa a perceber que ele não é só uma questão de mercado, uma questão do ponto de vista financeiro. Ele também é uma questão que tem impacto no acesso à informação, na capacidade, inclusive, de preservação desse direito de acesso à informação e dessa concepção de uma internet, de um acesso, uma conectividade efetivamente efetiva para as pessoas. Então, eu entendo que esse é um debate que está colocado no mundo, e no Brasil não é diferente, porque todas as maneiras que a gente olha para as questões do ponto de vista do enfrentamento à desinformação, da capacidade de levar maior conectividade, da capacidade de garantir maior acesso à informação e capacidade de comunicação entre as pessoas, esse tema ele sempre estará acompanhando o debate. Então, obviamente, a gente tem áreas no governo que olham especificamente para isso, seja dentro do Ministério da Justiça, seja dentro do Ministério das Comunicações, até mesmo dentro do Ministério da Ciência e Tecnologia, e nós também por esse viés de enfrentamento à desinformação e garantia de direito, de liberdade de expressão, comunicação e troca entre as pessoas. Então, é um debate que a gente quer fazer. Do ponto de vista da capacidade que nós temos hoje, ela tem essas limitações legais que nós acreditamos que podem ser resolvidas, não só pelos órgãos e autoridades competentes, como também elas serão resolvidas no momento em que a gente tiver uma lei aprovada que garante maior transparência nas relações entre entre esses atores todos que estão colocados no debate. Então, nós avaliamos que é importante, queremos fazer a discussão com todas as limitações, dificuldades, complexidades que ela traz, mas acreditamos que isso também será facilitado no momento em que a gente tiver esse subsídio legal mais profundo.
Thank you, Samara. Professor Amelia, if you could comment on the zero rating regulations from abroad, maybe the UK or the US, it would be very helpful. Thank you.
So this is really not an area that I'm expert on at all. And that's partly because until very recently, the UK has been part of the EU, and the EU, as I understand it, doesn't allow zero rating. That's part of its open internet regulation. However, as you were speaking earlier, I just checked what the situation in the UK is, because obviously we're no longer part of the European Union. And in fact, Ofcom, our digital regulator, is currently consulting on relaxing those restrictions around zero rating. So listening to you today, I realized that this is an issue that I probably ought to give some more thought to.
Thank you. Any additional questions from the audience? So, I have a question for Commissioner Victor. I wanted to hear your thoughts on what do you think could be the best regulatory approach in Brazil from the regulator perspective, which is the best regulator for tackling digital markets concern.
Thank you, Rafaela. I think that's the most important question that we should think about nowadays. And in my personal opinion, I think that we are having very different perspectives and very different styles of regulation and coming from abroad initiatives. So when we see the DMA, for example, we can see that the DMA bundles and some more self-execution obligations with the obligations that are going to be further specified by the EU Commission. And when we see the UK proposal, I have the feeling that the UK proposal embraces some kind of regulatory strategy that must be, could be framed as a core regulatory proposal, maybe, because there is going to be the legislation, and then on top of that, there are going to be some code of conduct that will be issued by the DMU per which of the terms. So that's going to be a different approach of regulation in comparison with the DMA. And when we see the German new 19A chapter of the German Competition Act, we see that there's pretty much competition law as we know it. So that's issue expose enforcement, but the competition agency is having more broad, powerful tools. So I think that so far we cannot say what is the best fit, where is the best approach, and we can compare those approaches, and we see maybe what is the best solution to Brazil.
Thank you. So, if there is no additional question, oh, there is.
Can I just come in on that question, because
sure.
I do think that there's a benefit of looking at all the approaches and working out what is best for each country. But I do think that there's real serious benefit of as much alignment as possible. And I do think that, maybe, and I think this is an issue in the UK as well, we maybe aren't giving as much weight to the benefits of that alignment as we should. I heard you earlier talking about the need for a unique Brazilian approach, and the UK wants a unique UK approach, and I'm sure everywhere else wants their own unique approach. And to some extent, you can have unique approaches that nonetheless work really, really well together. We have that in mergers. Everywhere has their slight tweaks, but it broadly works as a global whole. But there is a real risk of creating something that doesn't really work. And I do think that all of us ought to be, very, very aware of that risk.
Thank you again, Professor Amelia. We have a question from the audience. Okay. Sylvia.
Hi, thank you all for the great panel. I'll have a question for Professor Amelia. You mentioned before something that I thought was very interesting about the indirect effect, or maybe some kind of positive externality about the DMA on the behavior and the strategy of the platforms in other jurisdictions, in the sense that they may behave according to DMA in other jurisdictions, which would be very great, because then would save a lot of public resources regulating them. So I don't know if you have more concrete, I know it's in the beginning of the discussion and maybe you do not have, but maybe you've already have a concrete example of this happening already in some other countries or some other jurisdiction. I don't know if you have something to share about it. Thank you so much.
I'm afraid it really is very early days, but what we have seen is, to some extent, GDPR, the data protection regulation in the EU, has had, to some extent, an impact worldwide, and certainly in the US. And so we think it could, this regulation could as well. I do think it will differ between the different rules. So, and a lot comes down to the costs of actually having different systems in different countries. So, for example, if it's about terms and conditions on an app store, they're already different in every jurisdiction. Changing them across jurisdictions is almost costless. So I don't expect you to see the same extraterritoriality effect there. When you're talking about things like interoperability, though, I think that is a very different situation, because you're actually creating a whole different technical solution and actually trying to actually run two distinct, or more than two distinct, technical solutions at the same time, just maybe technically very costly and risky. So I think there will be real differences. And I imagine, and I am not privy to this at all, but I imagine that the big platforms are at this moment trying to decide which things to do globally, which things to do regionally, and which things to do locally.
Thank you very much, Professor Amelia. Any additional? Sorry. Too many logistics. I'm not very good at it. Thank you. Okay. So, any additional questions? No additional questions. Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us today. It was a very, very enlightening debate, and it was a really, really pleasure to be moderating this panel and to see a lot of friendly faces today. Thank you.